Chris Brown, Manny Glad with you. And that time of the week means this person is joining us, at least all the way through the pre-draft period. Senior producer from NFL Films, Greg Cosell, joining us as we are going to talk pass rushers in this draft class, and considered by many to be the deepest position in the entire class. Before we jump headfirst into the pool here with the pass rushers, though, Greg, just curious, you see the Stefon Diggs extension, and while that's great in terms of locking him up, giving him long-term security, the fact remains that the Bills' really only true outside wideouts are Stefon Diggs and Gabriel Davis. They got some slot guys here, but there is a perceived need anyway from people like us that it's a position they may still have to address.
I would agree with that. And as we discussed a couple of weeks ago, Chris and Maddie, I don't think you were there then, but I think they're probably going to look for some speed, because even though both Diggs and Davis can get vertical on occasion, you wouldn't really call either one of those true vertical stretch kinds of receivers. And my sense is, given who the quarterback is and his ability to drive the ball down the field as well as anyone in the league, that they would like to see some speed on the perimeter. And the nice thing about that is that player does not have to be a quote-unquote big-time number one. He needs to be more of a niche receiver who brings a vertical element. So you don't necessarily need that guy in the first round. Now, obviously, we don't know what they're going to do, but I would think they would address that position for sure.
Yeah, it'll be intriguing to see who they draft at wide receiver if they choose to draft that position on day 1 or day 2. I'm really interested to see if any receivers are going to fall to maybe 25, if anybody's going to be sticking out there for the Bills to grab. But edge rusher is the position in this year's NFL draft. We've heard this name so many times talked about. He's going to go super early. It's Aiden Hutchinson. Would you like to break down Aiden Hutchinson? What does he bring to the NFL? What are some of his strengths and something that, teams won't be able to live without, especially the teams drafting in the top 3?
Well, he's a very good prospect. I wouldn't call him special. There's no Von Millers in this draft as far as pass rushers. And it's funny, Chris, you mentioned that people view it as deep. I think it's deep, but I don't think it's special. So I would say Hutchinson is a strong prospect. He's got excellent body length, although some view his arm length, which is extremely short for his height, as a potential issue. But he's very quick off the ball. He can rush the quarterback, as they say, from tip to tip, meaning he can work the high side, the outside, and the low side inside. He has a really good inside counter move. He works hands, hips, feet really well. He's extremely well coordinated in that way, has good play strength. And what really stood out, and this is why I really enjoy watching full games, is he had a plan, a pass rush plan for everybody he faced. And I think that's something you rarely see in college football with pass rushers who tend to rely on their physical ability and their traits. But he had a plan for attacking who he played against, and that's a really positive sign.
The thing for me about him, Greg, is there are no wasted opportunities with him. I don't know if there's a guy that finishes better than him in the class. If there's an opportunity, he's usually cashing in on it. You could probably count on one hand the opportunities he's had in the offensive backfield that he did not make good on.
That's a great point. He didn't miss much at all, if anything. And I saw a lot of tape and a lot of games. And I think he's a guy that could fit into multiple front looks, because he obviously can play on the outside. He can play standing up. He can play with his hand in the ground. He had numerous snaps inside at 3 technique and sub fronts. So you can do a lot with Hutchinson. And while you wouldn't call him special in terms of his traits, because he's not a sudden or twitchy athlete, he's just a very, very good player, and the kind of guy, to me, that'll be a really good player for a lot of years in the league.
And while I think he's probably your highest floor player, NFL ready player, the guy that may have the highest ceiling is a guy who does not have short arms, Trayvon Walker, 35.5-inch arms, Greg.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Walker's an interesting guy, Chris, because he didn't really play as an edge rusher at Georgia. I mean, he obviously lined up as a wide 9 player at times, but that's not what he really did. He played both on the outside. He played more snaps on the inside. So he's a guy that if you draft him early and say he's my edge pass rusher, that's a bit of a projection. Now, I really like the player. His measurables were outstanding. You mentioned the arm length. He really had a very fast 40-yard dash for a 6'5", 272-pound player. But I think he's a guy that his game is more physical than speed and burst. He's got really heavy hands. He's physical, strong. Now, he does have very good short area quickness. That's something that really stood out on tape. And there's a powerful feel to his game. But I think he's just scratching the surface of what he may or may not become as a pass rusher. And, when I watched his tape, I thought of a player that came out of Kentucky a number of years ago, actually as a 4th-round pick, and has turned into a good pro, but it didn't happen right away. And that's Darius Smith. And they're about the same size. And as I said, you do have to make a projection with Walker if you draft him and say he's an edge pass rusher, because that's not really what he did a lot of, even though he showed he could do it.
Another interesting player who's an Oregon product is Kayvon Thibodeaux. He's been talked about a lot, maybe for some of the quotes he's had and in different certain situations and scenarios, but he shows up on tape. What is different about Kayvon Thibodeaux when you're talking about these different edge rushers?
Yeah, he's another guy that I'll be fascinated to see how his career goes, because he has excellent get off. He's twitchy when he gets off the snap. And explosive in that way. He's more of a speed to power rusher. There's a physicality to his game. The issue for him is his lower body stiffness. What he really struggles to do is to flatten his rush path when he clears as they call it, the arc. When he gets beyond the offensive tackle on the outside, they call that the arc. When he clears that arc, he really struggles to flatten his rush path because he's got lower body stiffness. The player he kind of reminds me of, and he's 20 pounds less, is Jadeveon Clowney, because Clowney is probably going to be with his 5th team at the age of 28. And as you guys know, if you're a premier edge pass rusher, you're not with 5 teams by the age of 28, because Clowney is not a premier edge pass rusher and really never has been. And Thibodeaux kind of reminds me of him, just because of the lower body stiffness and inflexibility, and he can't really work off the edge at a high level.
A guy that was a former teammate of Trayvon Walker decided to transfer to get more playing time, and boy, did he make the most of it at Florida State. Jermaine Johnson, who is kind of a long-bodied guy.
Yes.
His arms aren't quite as long, but I'd take 34 inches if I was an NFL team with this guy, Jermaine Johnson.
Yeah, I liked his tape quite a bit. You're right. He left Georgia because Georgia has, everybody on their defense is a 5-star recruit out of high school, and you just can't play every snap. So I think he really is a guy that is just scratching the surface of what he can be as a true edge player. He plays much stronger than his frame. He's got kind of a lean, wiry frame, but there's a power element to his game, both as a run defender and a pass rusher. And he's got natural quickness to him. I wouldn't say he's a natural bender off the edge, but he can bend. And I think there's much to unlock as a pass rusher when it comes to technique, counters. And I think that, I guess the way I think about him, it wouldn't surprise me, guys, if in 2-3 years we're talking about him as arguably the best edge pass rusher. Maybe not the best player overall, although I think he and Hutchinson, they could be right there together. But I think Johnson really has a lot to offer.
I think a lot of Bills fans would be shocked if the Bills drafted an edge rusher with the number 25 pick in the NFL draft. But there have been a couple that have been mocked to the Buffalo Bills out of the mock drafts that we have tracked. And one of those players is George Karlaftis out of Purdue. He's actually been mocked to the Buffalo Bills once at that number 25 spot. So what makes George Karlaftis an interesting candidate, maybe not for the Bills, but for whoever decides to draft him? He's 6'4" and 266 pounds.
Yeah, he's one of those kind of old school base DNs that you get from the Big Ten. In some ways like Epinesa. Karlaftis was a state high school shot put champion, and that shows up in the way in which he plays. He's incredibly strong in his upper body, strong, powerful hands, tremendous upper body strength. And he has a nuanced feel to how to attack offensive tackles. Another guy with a plan. The issue with Karlaftis is his lower body does not necessarily support what he can do with his upper body and his hands. He's not very flexible in his lower body. So what you see a lot with him is he'll do really well in the initial part of a pass rush where his hands and his strength really are a factor, and then he gets stuck. And one of the things that stood out was too often he stopped his feet because he couldn't really support with his legs what his upper body was doing. So, but he's a guy that, as far as the Bills, if he was a Bill, people would love him because the competitiveness, the effort, the playing personality, as I call it, that just jumps off the charts. You just love watching this guy play.
Yeah, maybe a little bit like an Aaron Schobel type in a bit of a way.
I could see that. I remember him. Yeah, absolutely.
Another guy who I think is scratching the surface a little bit because he's still young in football, but a high motor player and a former soccer player, so I'm instantly a fan here. Arnold Ebiketie, Penn State. And the thing about him was this guy, I just like the way he dips and rips around the edge. That might be the only move he has right now, but it's a pretty darn good one.
Yes, you're right. It's funny you say that because he pretty much just attacks the high side right now because he's still learning. He only played 1 year at Penn State after transferring from Temple, had a great year in the Big Ten, but he's got just what you said, Chris. He has flexibility. He has bend. He can clear the arc. Unlike Thibodeaux, he can flatten and close with burst and speed to the quarterback. But you're right. He needs a lot of work. He must develop a wider array of pass rush moves and counters. He has to learn to work the low side of offensive tackles. But there's a lot there athletically. He would strike me as a guy that coaches would like in their room because you can work with this kid. When you have that kind of quickness, that kind of bend and flexibility, that's where you start, and it's a good place to start.
Another Michigan product is David Ojabo, and you speak of soccer players. He played soccer and basketball, and actually is from Scotland, so has quite the backstory to him. What jumps off the tape when you turn his tape on?
And it's a shame with what happened to him because it's funny that when you put on Michigan tape, and obviously you're seeing Hutchinson and Ojabo, Ojabo is just a more explosive guy off the ball than Hutchinson. Ojabo is another guy that can flatten the rush path. He is an explosive, sudden mover, and you hope he can remain that way after the Achilles injury. But he plays fast. He's a high-velocity player. He has great balance and body control. He can drive through what we call half-man resistance by offensive tackles, which is different than just pure speed to power. But he can, because he can challenge the edge so fast, he gets to the half man of offensive tackles, and he can just drive right through that. And he's another guy that's young, playing the position, so there's much more to be unleashed. And as I said, I hope that can happen because he was kind of a fun watch.
Yeah, the Achilles injury.
It was tough to watch.
You know, Chris, who he kind of reminded me of? He kind of reminded me of Robert Quinn coming out of North Carolina.
Oh, okay. That's not
probably
about
10 years ago. Yeah, probably about 10 years ago, I guess it was at this point.
Yeah.
But that's who he reminded me of.
Yeah, if I'm an NFL team, I'd be pretty happy with that. Another pass rusher that I've seen mocked to the Bills a couple of times is the kid out of Minnesota, Boye Mafe. The thing about him, for me, is I'm trying to decide, Greg, because I've only watched a couple of his games, so it's probably not enough. But he seems like he's a bit stiff-hipped, but at the same time, he seems explosive off the snap. So I'm having trouble on where I want to come down on him.
And that's a great point because he is an explosive athlete, and he certainly has that sort of size, length, athleticism profile that you like. And the combine measurables showed his explosive traits. But he's still learning how to rush the quarterback. He can challenge the high side immediately, and every once in a while you'd see a flash, you almost have to look at the flashes and hope that he can develop more consistency in executing those flashes, because he can be tantalizing. But there's too many frustrating pass rush reps at this point where he got stopped just before the arc and he didn't have any answers. And he needs to develop some answers. But you're right. I wouldn't say he's stiff, but he's just not as loose as you'd like. But he plays the run really, really well.
And then the final player we're going to look at is Drake Jackson out of USC. He had 5 sacks in the 2021 season. So why would teams maybe be interested in Drake Jackson?
Because he's close to 6'3", 254. His arm length is pretty good as well. He sort of fits that profile, Maddie, of the long, athletic, flexible edge rusher. Those guys are always in demand. Another guy that showed flashes. Some of his really good plays, you go, wow, look at the quickness, look at the burst, look at the flexibility. There were times he reminded me of Leonard Floyd when Floyd came out of Georgia. There's that size, there's that length. I think Floyd is a little taller, but Jackson looks tall on tape, even though he's just under 6'3". But I think he's another guy that's a little raw and unrefined in how he goes about rushing the quarterback. So he has a chance to develop into a quality edge rusher. He'll need coaching. He'll need refinement. And I think guys like that, could they get drafted on day 2? Absolutely. But it wouldn't surprise me if he's an early day 3 guy. But because he can rush the quarterback, he could well be a day 2 pick.
Here's another guy I was a little mixed on, Greg, because I watched some of his junior tape, and he just looked too light in the pants to hold in there on line of scrimmage battles. I haven't really watched much.
Jackson?
Yeah, and I haven't really watched much of his tape from 21. So has he gotten stronger? Is he holding in at the line of scrimmage better? Setting the edge, those kinds of things. He just looks a little thin in the pants,
and I would agree with that.
To anchor.
I would agree, because I made the point that overall he must get stronger throughout his body, and you hope that comes with maturity in an NFL weight room, although I assume USC has a pretty good facility. But you're right about that, Chris. He needs to get stronger overall. And when offensive linemen got his hands on him early in the down, he struggled to get off that. So that's something that definitely needs to happen if you're going to see him down the road as a full-time player.
And then finally, Greg, I know you mentioned you think Jermaine Johnson could be one of the best pure pass rushers in this class a few years down the road. But do you have a favorite? Is there a true favorite of yours from this group that, opened your eyes the most?
Well, I think the more I watched of 2 guys, the more I liked them. It would be Hutchinson and Jermaine Johnson. I think those guys are going to be good players. I think when it comes to pass rushers, as I said, I don't think there's that special guy. Can't remember who I was talking to about this, but somebody said to me that in an ideal world, if this was a great draft class where you had quarterbacks and the whole deal, that someone like Hutchinson would probably be seen as about the 15th pick in the draft. But it's not that kind of draft. Yeah. And, when it's your turn, you got to draft. You're not going to say, I'll pass. So, guys are going to get drafted. And Hutchinson is probably not probably, he's the most complete as we speak right now. And I think Johnson has a chance to be even more dynamic as a pass rusher than Hutchinson. So we'll see as we go down the road.
All right, Greg. Well, listen, we thank you for the insight and all of the tape grinding, because I don't know if I could do that without falling asleep in my chair sometimes.
Well,
I don't know. Do your eyes ever?
I
got to ask
you. Any secrets here, Chris?
I got to ask you. Do your eyes ever glaze over to the point where you're like, I got to step away for a little bit. I got to go get lunch or something.
Yeah, sometimes. I normally don't step away. I just, do stupid stuff like to look at social media, but I don't like. Usually, I don't just get up and walk around, but no, sometimes I just have to take a break, particularly when I'm watching full games, because you got to get a feel for the game in addition to the player.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have to believe your optometrist has to get some kind of kickback for all the tape. But thanks as always, Greg. We appreciate the time. We'll catch up with you.
Thanks, Greg.
All right. Thanks, guys.